They had fire for 300,000 years before they cooked a single meal with it. Think about that. 300,000 years, longer than our entire species has existed, they sat beside the fire and used it for almost nothing. This is the story of the most important discovery in human history. And the 300,000 years it took to figure out what it was actually for. The group that would make the first accidental step toward cooking fire didn't seek it out. They were doing what every Homo erectus group did when a natural fire appeared on the savanna. They stopped, and they watched. The watching came before everything. Before the approach. Before the use. Before any understanding of what the thing even was. Researchers studying Homo erectus fire sites have documented something both obvious and profound. The earliest evidence of fire use shows no evidence of cooking. Just proximity. For a period that is genuinely difficult to comprehend, the fire was simply there, and the people were beside it, and that was apparently sufficient. The warmth was enough. The light was enough. Just existing near it was enough. The natural grass fire that swept the savanna that day would have been terrifying to every other species present. The animals fled. Only one species moved toward it. Not out of bravery, out of something more complicated. A nervous system that had developed, over millions of years, the specific capacity to be interested in things that were dangerous. To watch the dangerous thing instead of running from it. Doru was the oldest member of the group. At 40 in a species where most died before 30, he carried knowledge in his body that nobody else held. He had seen fire before. Not often. But the body remembered the warmth. And the body moved toward the warmth before the mind had formed any opinion about whether this was wise. The scar on Doru's forearm was the oldest fire record in the group, the evidence of a previous encounter stored not in memory but in skin. The body learns from fire before the mind has language to describe the lesson. The scar said, "Close is warm, closer is damage." The arm extended toward the warmth at precisely the distance the scar had established as the limit. Here is one of the most disturbing facts about early fire use. Researchers at the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa found evidence of fire use dating to 1 million years ago. They found burnt animal bones and burnt plant material. What they did not find, for another 300,000 years, was evidence that the fire was being used to cook food. The fire and the food were both present. The connection between them was not. The charred ground behind a natural fire is a completely different landscape from the one that existed an hour before. Every surface changed. Every smell changed. The warmth radiating from the earth was a completely new sensory experience, warmth from below rather than above, warmth without visible source, warmth in a material the body had never previously encountered as warm. Brack's hands hovering above the blackened earth were performing the oldest calibration test in human history. The testing gesture, hands hovering above a surface, one finger extending for brief contact, then withdrawing, is the oldest diagnostic behavior documented in the Homo erectus record. It appears in stone tool assessment. It appears in food assessment. It appears here, in fire-adjacent ground assessment. The hands as the primary instrument of a species learning its world through direct contact, one brief touch at a time. The charred tubers were not sought. They were found. This is the most important distinction in the archaeology of cooking. For the first 300,000 years of fire use, cooked food was always accidental. The fire produced it as a byproduct. Nobody planned the meal. The fire cooked the food and the group found the result. The insight that you could deliberately cook food, that was still 300,000 years away. The technique of rolling a hot object with a stick rather than touching it directly is so obvious that it is easy to underestimate what it represents. The use of an existing tool for a completely new purpose, in a situation that has never occurred before, arrived at through the logic of the moment rather than instruction or memory. Doru did not decide to use the staff this way. The staff was in his hand, the tuber was hot, and the hand found the solution. The smell of cooked food is, according to evolutionary biologists, one of the most universally attractive smells to the human nervous system across all cultures, all populations, all individuals. This is not learned. It is the product of millions of years of selection pressure favoring organisms that responded positively to cooked food's smell because cooked food provided more usable energy. Doru was responding to something his genes had been waiting for, without knowing it, for millions of years. The watching behavior visible around Doru's first taste of cooked food is the precursor to every food review in history. The social transmission of food safety information through observation of another person's facial response is so deeply embedded in human neural architecture that it operates faster than conscious thought. Yeva was reading Doru's face before Doru had finished processing the taste. Scientists studying the digestive efficiency of cooked versus raw food have found that cooked food provides approximately 30% more usable energy from the same quantity of calories. For a species operating at the margins of caloric survival, 30% is not a marginal improvement. It is the difference between a brain that can afford to grow larger and a brain that cannot. The cooked tuber in Doru's mouth was the first payment on a debt that evolution would collect over the next million years. The group around the dying fire, having eaten cooked food for the first time, would not cook another deliberate meal for decades. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is the nature of discovery without language. The connection between fire and food had been made once, accidentally, in a specific location, and stored in 4 bodies as a sensory memory with no conceptual framework attached to it. No word to retrieve it by. No story to place it in. The first carrying of an ember was not a decision. It was a continuation, the same impulse that had kept both hands near the warmth rather than walking away, now in motion, the warmth moving because the body was moving. The connection between staying warm and keeping ember established by accident in a single evening and driving behavior for a million years afterward. The posture of fire carrying, the specific arm extension, the careful pace, the attention divided between the carried flame and the terrain ahead, became, over the million years of Homo erectus fire use, one of the most characteristically human physical postures. Every torchbearer in every Olympic ceremony. Every person carrying a birthday cake with lit candles. Every surgeon holding a light source in a dim corridor. All of them inheriting the specific posture that Braque arrived at through the simple imperative of keeping the flame from going out. The moment fire entered an enclosed space for the first time was a transformative event that the individuals experiencing it could not recognize as transformative. What changed was the relationship between inside and outside. The outside's darkness and danger and cold were, for the first time, partially separated from the inside's warmth and light and safety. Architecture was born in the moment a fire was placed inside a shelter. Not the shelter. The fire inside it. The 3 faces watching the fire-lit interior of the shelter for the first time were experiencing something that neuroscientists studying fire response in modern humans have found remarkable, the firelight-induced reduction in cortisol, the stress hormone, that occurs specifically in response to fire viewed in an enclosed or semi-enclosed space. The effect is measurable. The mechanism is evolutionary. Fire inside a shelter tells the oldest parts of the nervous system, you are safe enough. The cortisol drops. The tension releases. This is what rest actually feels like. The rock walls of the shelter, visible in full for the first time in the fire's light, showed a space that the group had occupied for months but never seen. The bumps and crevices and natural color variations in the sandstone, features that defined the space they lived in, had existed in total darkness every time they were inside it. The fire didn't just warm the shelter. It revealed it. For the first time, the group could see the walls of their own home. Looking at one's own hands by firelight for the first time is, researchers believe, one of the precursor experiences to self-recognition, to the organism beginning to see its own body as an object that can be examined rather than simply the instrument through which the world is encountered. The hands by firelight are visible in a way they are not in darkness. They are a surface with texture and line and detail. Before fire, the hands were the ends of the arms. In firelight, they were something to look at. The extinction of a carried fire was not understood by Homo erectus as reversible. For the first years of fire use, when the fire went dark, the group understood only that the fire was gone, not that it could be remade, not that a surviving ember might reignite with the right encouragement. The loss of a fire was, for early Homo erectus, total. The hovering hands over the dying branch were the hands of someone watching something die that they did not know could be reborn. The darkness that returned after the first fire's extinction was the same darkness as before, but it was now experienced as the absence of something rather than simply as the dark. Absence requires prior presence. Fire had been present. Now it was absent. The dark was different from the dark before the fire because the brain had been recalibrated by the light. This is the neurological basis of every form of deprivation-based suffering. Not what is absent in absolute terms. What is absent relative to what has been known. The morning assessment of the dead branch, cold in the hand, ash on the thumb, no warmth, is the first archaeological evidence of what researchers call instrumental assessment of a lost resource. The object that had performed a function is examined after it has stopped performing that function. The examination is useless, it cannot restore the function, but it happens anyway. This is the beginning of human relationship with objects as things that have states and histories and endings. The weight of the problem visible in Brack's face on the morning after the first fire extinction is, in some sense, the weight of the entire human future. How do you keep it? How do you make it? How do you ensure it is there when you need it? These questions, implicit in the face examining the cold branch, are the questions that would eventually produce the clay ember carrier, the fire-making technique, the fire-keeper role, the vestal flame, the eternal torch, the nuclear reactor. The same question. 300,000 years of increasingly sophisticated answers. Carrying the extinguished branch was not rational. The branch was cold and provided no function. But Brack carried it. The attachment to the object that had held the fire was stronger than the logic of discarding it. This is object attachment, the emotional relationship between an organism and an object associated with a significant experience, operating 1 million years before psychology had a name for it and before any language existed to describe it. The cold burnt ground of the previous fire, searched for warmth and finding none, is the moment in the archaeological record where the concept of fire as a temporally bounded event begins to form. Before fire, experiences were either ongoing or ended. Fire introduced a new temporal category, something that was here and is now gone but left physical evidence of its presence. The ash. The black earth. The cold where there was warm. Time made visible in material form. The dead ember in the hand, cold, gray, providing no warmth, is the Homo erectus equivalent of holding a photograph of someone who is no longer present. The object retains the shape of the thing that animated it but not the animation itself. The ember is the fossil of a fire. The species holding it has not yet developed the concept of fossil or the concept of fire as a thing that ends and can begin again. They have only the cold object and the absence of warmth that should be there. Here is what made fire addictive in the specific neurological sense. The firelight's flicker rate, approximately 8 to 12 Hz, corresponds to alpha brainwave frequency, the frequency associated with relaxed alertness. Watching a fire puts the human brain into a specific neurological state that is measurably different from watching static light. Homo erectus sitting beside the fire for hours was experiencing something their neurology had been shaped by evolution to find rewarding. They weren't just sitting near the warmth. They were, in a technically accurate sense, getting high. The behavior of running toward fire, documented repeatedly at Homo erectus sites, is one of the most counterintuitive behaviors in the hominin record. Every other large mammal on the savanna fled from natural fire. The flight response was universal and immediate. Only Homo erectus had developed a nervous system complex enough to override the flight response in the presence of fire, to replace it with a run-toward response. This override is what made every subsequent development possible. The fire capture technique, thrusting a branch into a natural fire to light it, was not invented. It was arrived at through the specific logic of a hand that wanted to hold warmth and found that holding a burning stick was the closest available approximation. The behavior is documented at multiple early Homo erectus fire sites across Africa and Asia. Different groups. Different locations. The same technique. Not because they communicated it, but because it is the obvious solution for a body that understands carrying and wants to carry fire. The mobile fire, fire that moves with the group rather than being encountered at fixed locations, changed the relationship between the species and its territory more profoundly than any previous development. Before mobile fire, territory was defined by what the landscape provided: water sources, food availability, predator distribution. After mobile fire, territory was defined by where the group chose to take its fire. The fire made every location a potential home. The world got larger. The establishment of the fire circle as the group's organizational center happened without any decision being made about organization. The fire was placed in the center because it was the central thing: the light, the warmth, the food, the protection. The group arranged itself around it. The circle formed around the thing that mattered. This is how every human organizational structure forms, not by design but by the specific gravity of whatever the group has decided, explicitly or implicitly, matters most. The fuel collection, gathering dry grass and bark on the return walk to the shelter, was the first deliberate preparation for a future need. Not for the immediate moment. For the next fire-tending session, hours away. This forward planning, the accumulation of resources for a future use, is a cognitive milestone. The brain that collects fuel is planning. The brain that collects fuel is the brain that will eventually plant seeds. The fuel addition behavior, the first deliberate feeding of the fire, represents the moment fire changed from something that happened to the group to something the group managed. Before this moment, fire was received from the natural world and kept or lost. After this moment, fire was maintained by the group through deliberate action. The relationship inverted. Homo erectus went from being fire followers to fire keepers in a single gesture of adding a handful of dry grass to a dying flame. The predator at the shelter entrance, its eyes reflecting the fire from the edge of the darkness, experienced something its evolutionary history had not prepared it for: a large prey species behind a barrier that the predator's nervous system categorized as dangerous without the predator understanding why. Fire deterrence of predators is one of the most consequential effects of fire use, and one of the most difficult to document archaeologically because it works through absence: the attacks that didn't happen, the individuals who survived because the fire was maintained. Modern studies of lion and leopard behavior near campfires confirm what the fossil record implies: large predators maintain a consistent avoidance distance from open fire regardless of hunger level. The predator's nervous system, shaped by millions of years of avoiding grass fires, could not distinguish a campfire from a wildfire's edge. Every time Brack fed the fire during the night, the deterrent radius held. Every night the fire was maintained, the group slept more safely than any of their predecessors had ever slept. Senna's expression after the predator withdrew was not relief. It was recalibration. The recognition, operating in the body before it could operate in any other form, that the maintained fire had done something the group had not deliberately asked it to do. It had held the darkness back. Not as a decision. Not as a strategy. As a consequence of the warmth that happened to be there. The safety was a side effect. And it was more valuable than the warmth. The morning fire check ritual, wake and immediately assess the state of the fire, is one of the oldest human behaviors. It is documented in the ethnographic record of every fire-using group studied in the 20th century: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of the Kalahari, the Inuit of the Arctic. The first action upon waking, in every fire-using culture that has ever been observed, is to check the fire. The nervous system's first question every morning, for a million years, is the most important thing still alive? The clay ember carrier, a purpose-built container for the specific function of transporting fire, is the first evidence in the Homo erectus record of a tool made not for immediate use but for a future use that has been anticipated. The carrier is not used the moment it is made. It is made so that something else can be preserved and moved. This is the cognitive architecture of every storage technology in human history: the anticipation of a future need and the construction of a solution before the need arrives. The handprint impressions on the clay ember carrier, the accidental record of the hands that formed it pressed into the wet clay before it dried, are the oldest unintentional self-portraits in the human record. The maker did not intend to leave a record of the hands. The clay recorded them anyway. This is how most of human history has been preserved, not through the deliberate acts of recording but through the accidental impressions left in the materials that outlasted the people who shaped them. The river crossing problem, the recognition that water would kill the embers before the crossing was complete, required a level of forward planning that is remarkable at this date in the fossil record. Brack had to anticipate a future state of the ember carrier based on prior knowledge of water's effect on fire. Prior knowledge that was not directly applicable to this specific situation because this situation had never occurred before. The application of prior knowledge to a novel situation is the operational definition of general intelligence. The image of a body submerged to the shoulders in a cold river with both arms raised above the water to hold the fire carrier dry is the image of a species that has decided, without deciding, that fire is worth more than comfort. Worth more than warmth. Worth the specific discomfort of cold river water against the skin while the arms are extended at their limit holding the thing that provides the warmth that the river is currently preventing. The investment is total. The logic is body level. The decision was never made. Every Vestal Virgin in ancient Rome who maintained the sacred flame of the state for 30 years of dedicated service was performing a more elaborate version of what Brack performed at the river crossing, prioritizing the preservation of a specific fire above every competing demand of the immediate moment. The flame was the city. The flame was the state. The flame had to be kept. The river crossing was the first version of this idea, performed 1 million years before Rome existed. The rainstorm that threatened the fire network was, in the context of this group's fire-dependent existence, the most significant natural event since the first fire encounter. The difference was that this time, fireless was not the natural state. Fireless was a deprivation. The group had been fire-dependent for approximately 3 years by the time this rainstorm arrived. 3 years is long enough to build the neural architecture of dependency. The threat of losing fire felt, in the body, like the threat of losing something essential. Because it was. The extinction of the home fire in the rainstorm was the first natural disaster in this group's experience, not in the sense of scale but in the sense of structure, a natural event destroying a human-constructed resource. Before fire, natural events were simply the world doing what the world did. After fire, nature could now destroy something the group had made. This is the beginning of the human relationship with natural disaster, not as background condition but as threat to infrastructure. The faint thread of smoke from the clay ember carrier under the rain, suggesting one surviving coal, is the oldest documented version of backup. Not understood as backup. Not designed as backup. But functioning as backup, the secondary storage that survives when the primary fails. Every backup system in every technology ever built by human beings descends from the impulse that produced the clay ember carrier, the understanding that the primary source can fail and the response of building a secondary before it does. The lightning flash that illuminated all 4 faces in the shelter during the rainstorm, 4 faces showing the same expression they wore on the very first night before fire was ever used here, is the image of how thin the line between the fire-dependent group and the pre-fire group actually was. 3 years of fire use, 3 years of dependency, 3 years of reorganizing the entire structure of daily life. Around the maintained flame, and 1 rainstorm returned everything to before. The fire was 3 years old. The darkness was 1 million years old. Doru's instinct to strike stones together in the darkness was not fire-making. Not yet. It was the behavior of a body searching for the mechanism of something it has seen but cannot replicate. The sparks from iron pyrite struck with flint are not random, they are a consistent and reproducible phenomenon. Doru had seen sparks before. The body remembered that sparks were fire-adjacent. The body was searching for the path from sparks to fire with no language to guide the search and no guarantee the path existed. The iron pyrite and flint fire-starting method, independently discovered by multiple human groups across the world and documented at archaeological sites from Africa to Europe to Asia, produces sparks at temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to ignite dry tinder. The method works. It has always worked. The only variable is the tinder's dryness. On this night, in this shelter, with the rain's humidity in the air, the tinder was slightly too damp. Doru was one variable from solving the 300,000-year problem. The variable was the weather. The morning after the rainstorm, the question of whether the clay ember carrier had preserved even one surviving coal through the night was the most urgent question in the group's experience. Not a predator. Not a food shortage. Whether the fire had survived. The inversion of priorities that fire produces in the groups that adopt it is one of the most remarkable documented effects of fire use in the archaeological record. The species that acquired fire became a species whose primary concern was keeping the fire. The single surviving coal at the center of the clay ember carrier, barely alive, orange-red at its core against surrounding gray ash, is the most important object in this entire story. Not the first fire. Not the fire-making tools. The surviving coal. Because what the surviving coal demonstrates is that the system works, the backup held, the network has a single surviving node, and from that node the full network can be rebuilt. One coal. The entire future of fire use in this territory resting on 3 centimeters of barely glowing carbon. The revival of a fire from a single surviving coal, blowing controlled breath onto the coal, placing tinder around it, watching the glow expand, is called the fire-breathing technique, and it is documented across every fire-using human culture that has ever been studied. From the San of the Kalahari to the Inuit of the Arctic to every scout program in every country that teaches outdoor survival. The technique is identical across 1,000,000 years and every cultural context. The coal revives with breath and tinder. This has always been true. It was true the first time it happened. The revived fire in the shelter after the rainstorm was, in some measurable sense, a different fire from the one that had existed before the rain. Not different in material, the same coals, the same fuel, the same stone ring. Different in meaning. The group now knew something it had not known before, that the fire could survive. That the network could be reduced to a single point and rebuilt from that point. That the rainstorm was not the end. This knowledge, stored in 4 bodies with no language to articulate it, would drive every subsequent decision the group made about how to maintain the fire. 2 years after the first fire encounter, the group's camp showed the accumulated evidence of fire as a permanent feature of their lives, the worn stone ring, the fuel cache, the repaired clay carrier, the night work that firelight made possible. The fire had reorganized everything. When the group slept, who slept and who watched? What tools were made and when? Where the camp was positioned relative to fuel and shelter. The fire was not a tool any more than language is a tool. It was a medium through which the entire structure of daily life was reorganized. The first deliberate cooking, the 3 hindquarters suspended over the fire on forked sticks, happened approximately 700,000 years after the species acquired fire, in our geological record. For 300,000 years they had fire and didn't cook with it. Then one group, possibly this group, possibly one very much like it, understood the connection. Not as a theory. As an action. As the movement of a hand placing food near fire and waiting to see what happened next. The 300,000-year gap between fire and cooking is not a mystery of intelligence. It is a mystery of connection. The color change of cooking meat, from the raw red to the cooked brown, the surface sealing, the fat beginning to render, is one of the most visually informative signals in food safety. Cooked meat does not carry the pathogen load of raw meat at the same level. The color change is the visible indicator of the pathogen reduction. 700,000 years before food safety was a concept, the color change of cooking meat was a cue that the nervous system learned to associate with safe food. The cue is still in use. The reasoning has changed. The cue has not. The specific satisfaction of a digestive system receiving food that is more efficiently processed than anything in its prior experience is one of the deepest food pleasures available to the human nervous system. Not taste, though cooked food tastes better than raw. Not fullness, though cooked food is more filling per unit of raw material. The specific pleasure is the one that happens below consciousness, the gut processing food with less friction, the caloric yield higher, the energy available for other uses. Doru was experiencing the pleasure of efficiency, which is, underneath everything, the pleasure that drives civilization. The first deliberately cooked meal as a collective experience, all four figures eating simultaneously around the fire, the social attention of the group available to each other during the meal, is the origin of the social function of food. Before fire, eating was individual and sequential. You ate when you had food, where the food was, as fast as you safely could. After fire-cooked meals, eating became an event that the group participated in together. The fire circle was the first dining table. The cooked meal was the first social occasion. The fire network, 3 maintained fire points across the group's territory, each tended, each serving specific functions for the group's movements across the landscape, is the first infrastructure in the archaeological record. Not in the sense of buildings or engineering. In the sense of deliberate resource placement across a defined territory for the benefit of the group's activities across that territory. The 3 fires were a network. The group was an administrator. 700,000 years before the first city, before the first road, before the first aqueduct, infrastructure. The morning fire check ritual, 5 years in, performed with the automaticity of action repeated 10,000 times, this is what expertise feels like from the inside. Not conscious thought applied to a familiar task. The task running itself through the body while the conscious mind is still waking. Every expert in every field performs the core operations of their expertise this way, automatically, efficiently, below the level of deliberation, after sufficient repetition. Brack was an expert in fire. The morning check was his unconscious competence. The face of the fire keeper 5 years in carries something fundamentally different from the face of the fire watcher in the first scene. The fire watcher's face showed fascination, the pure cognitive response to encountering something categorically new. The fire keeper's face shows responsibility, the specific quality of identity organized around a duty. Brack was not watching the fire anymore. Brack was checking on it. The relationship had become one of stewardship. The fire was not a marvel. The fire was a charge. The made fire, fire produced from flint and iron pyrite rather than carried from a natural source, changed the species' relationship with its own survival more profoundly than any other single development in the period. Before made fire, the group was always downstream of a natural event. A lightning strike, a lava flow, a grass fire had to occur within capture range. After made fire, the group was independent. The fire could be created wherever the materials existed. The dependency on nature's provision of fire was ended. For the first time, the species could make the most important thing it possessed. The transmission of fire-making from Doru to Yeva without any language, only watching, only hands, only the specific attention of an observer who has understood that this knowledge is essential, is the model for every form of human knowledge transmission that predates writing. The entire technological heritage of Homo erectus moved through bodies and hands and watching. Nothing was written. Nothing was described. Everything was demonstrated, observed, practiced, and carried in the nervous system of the next person who watched long enough to learn. The 5 scratched marks on the shelter wall, made in the additional light that fire provides, serving no immediate survival function, are the earliest evidence in this story of something that would eventually become art, writing, mathematics, and every other symbolic system human beings have ever developed. They are not any of those things. They are scratches in sandstone made by a hand that was doing something with the surplus of light and time and safety that fire had created. They are what surplus produces, the first non-essential act. The first thing done for its own sake. The marks on the wall are not a count. Not a symbol. Not a message. They are marks on a wall, and they are the most important marks in this story. Because what they demonstrate is that the group now had enough warmth, enough light, enough safety, enough food, to do something that served no immediate survival purpose. The surplus of fire had produced a surplus of capacity. And the first thing that capacity produced was a hand making marks on a wall in the dark. The first luxury. The first art. The first step toward everything that followed. 9 years after the first fire encounter, the 6 maintained fire points across the group's territory represent something that had no precedent in the hominin record, a managed landscape. Not in the sense of farming or deliberate cultivation. In the sense of a species deliberately placing a resource at specific locations across a territory and maintaining that placement over time. The 6 fires were the first evidence of what would eventually become every settlement pattern, every urban plan, every infrastructure network in human history. 6 fires on a savanna. The first city. The body's signals visible in Doru's changed position, lying rather than seated, the staff resting beside rather than in the hand, are legible without words. The group reads them without language. The oldest knowledge in any social species is the knowledge of what it looks like when the most experienced member of the group is declining. The fire continues. The group continues. The transmission has occurred. The knowledge is in 3 other bodies now. The library has been copied before the original was lost. Doru's eye looking at the fire in the final scene is the oldest version of an image that will repeat through every subsequent chapter of human history, the experienced figure at rest beside the fire they spent their life maintaining, the light they tended reflected in the eye, the work done, the knowledge passed on, the fire still burning. Every elder who has sat beside a fire at the end of a long life and watched it burn is looking at the same fire that Doru is looking at. The fire has never gone out. It has changed forms. It has moved from wood to coal to gas to electricity to the screen in your hand right now. But it is the same fire. And you are still sitting beside it. The 6 fires visible from above, each one tended, each one a node in a network of knowledge distributed across a landscape, are the visible evidence of the decision that was never made. Nobody decided to use fire. Nobody decided to carry it. Nobody decided to keep it alive through the night, to cross the river with arms raised, to make a clay carrier, to strike the flint against the pyrite in the dark. Nobody decided that the fire was worth more than everything it cost to maintain. The species simply behaved as though it was. And in that behavior, without a word, without a decision, without a plan, the human world was built. If this story landed somewhere, drop a comment. Tell me which moment stayed with you. And tell me where in the world you are. This channel exists for people who want to understand what we actually are and how we got here. See you in the next one.